Are the scales of American justice weighed against people of color? From police shootings to everyday arrests, the numbers reveal a negative side of U.S. law enforcement. Our viewers are asking these tough questions. It's time to get some answers on VOA's Talk to America. I'm Cal Perry. This is a special one-hour edition of Talk to America. And today, we're going to try and tackle the tough questions that surround what is a very sensitive issue. We're going to try and have a frank conversation with our panel of experts. But before we do that, a look at how we got here and why we're here today. A number of high-profile, well-documented deaths at the hands of police officers seem to have awakened the rebel in America's youthful generation, opening old wounds in new places. Tragic deaths. A young black man from a St. Louis, Missouri suburb, Michael Brown, became the representative of so many members of racial minorities in this country who have felt mistreated their entire lives. He was shot multiple times during a struggle with a white police officer. Brown was unarmed. 1 month before Michael Brown was shot, Eric Gardner, selling cigarettes on the street in Staten Island, New York, a conservative borough of New York City, where many of the city's police reside, he died after being forcibly subdued by police. In the age of social media, the video goes viral as the police officer is cleared of all charges. Shortly after, the officer who shot Michael Brown thousands of miles away is also cleared. And those pent-up frustrations played out then on the streets across America. Of course, the people in the streets of New York and Washington are there because there are so many issues shrouded in these deaths. Hard issues, historically painful questions. It is unclear how many African Americans die each year at the hands of police because there is no uniform way of reporting the information. The best figures available from the Federal Bureau of Investigation suggest that nationwide there are about 400 cases of what officials call justifiable police homicides each year. Of that total, more than 1/4 of the victims are black, which is double the percentage of the African American population in the overall American population. Gardner exhaled the words, "I can't breathe," as he was held to the ground by police. And so now, a generation shows their colors as a matter of civil disobedience, armed again with social media at the highest level. We're here today because many people, not just in New York and Washington, Ferguson, Boston, Los Angeles, and Berkeley, are angry that Brown and Gardner are dead. We're here because they are saying African Americans are treated differently. Treated with disdain in a system where they say white Americans enjoy privileges that others do not.
I want us all to focus now on our spiritual center. Amen.
All right, I want to take a minute to introduce our viewers to our panel, and then we're going to play an interview that we'll have them listen to. Dr. Cedric Alexander, who is the Director of Public Safety in DeKalb County, joins us from there, and also he's the President of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement. From New York City, Whitney Dow, the Director and Producer of the Whiteness Project. Lori Friedel, a racial profiling expert, Associate Producer, joins us by Skype from the University of South Florida in Tampa. And here in our studio in Washington, Mady Henson, Mady Henson, educator, community activist. She's also done some work in Ferguson police training. She's also the president of the Covenant House, a homeless outreach service here in D.C. And lastly, certainly not least, our own VOA Chris Simpkins. He's been covering the U.S. Civil Rights Movement past and present. Welcome to everybody. Quickly, before I get to our panel, I want you all to listen to an interview that was conducted Monday with former Attorney General and now Judge Alberto Gonzalez, former U.S. Attorney General under President George W. Bush. He's now the Dean of the Belmont School of Law in Nashville, Tennessee. He's been watching the racial tensions as they mount, and I started by asking him if he was surprised by the protests that we've seen taking place across the country.
Was I surprised by the protest? Oh, no, I think that, it's the American way. It's a way that we express our views, disappointed in some of the violence. But obviously people have some very strong feelings about what happened both in Ferguson and in Staten Island. And, it's clear to me that we've got some issues that have to be resolved because certainly the African-American community, or at least segments of it, believe that they don't get the same level of justice as other people in the community, and I think that's something that we should all be looking at and seeing if, in fact, that is true, and if it's true, what can we do to address it?
And many of America's police, I think, at this point feel a little bit like they're on trial. What is your message to them?
Well, my message to them is that as I support them, as a former chief law enforcement official of this country, I know how hard these men and women work throughout America, and it is unfortunate that on rare occasions members of the police, engage in conduct that is unprofessional, and when they do something that's unlawful or unprofessional, there should be accountability for that. So, but by and large, I think it's important for the American people to know that law enforcement, they get up every day to do a job, and they do it well in almost every case.
You spoke there about accountability, and I wanted to ask you your thoughts on the prosecutional system here in the United States. The prosecutor obviously has to work very closely with local police authorities. Does there need to be some kind of independent outside arbiter when it comes to these kind of incidents?
I wouldn't say that's necessarily true. I think, again, prosecutors, overwhelmingly, I think they do a very professional job. I think that in most cases they recognize when in fact that they cannot be impartial, and when in fact there is bias that may affect their professional judgment. I am hopeful also that most prosecutors would recognize that even the appearance of impropriety is a problem for the execution of justice. And so I think that by and large prosecutors exercise the right discretion, the appropriate level of judgment, but they do need to be sensitive to the fact that there is a large segment of certainly the African American community that has some serious questions about whether or not the black community can obtain justice here in America.
And what is it that you think needs to be done to get to that point? Is it training of police officers? If it's not the prosecutor, what is it that we can do better?
Well, I think communication and dialogue is extremely important. And I think we're seeing police departments all around the country engage in sort of a self-evaluation. They're looking to see whether or not they've got the appropriate training. Do they have the appropriate gear in terms of dashboard cameras, body cameras? Of course, we had the incident in Staten Island that was recorded by a camera phone, and so that did make a difference in that particular case. But I think that police departments around the country are looking to see what they can do. I think perhaps community review boards. I think just having a dialogue is extremely important. I think for the community to understand the policing in their respective community is something that's very, very important. So I think one thing we're seeing that come out of these tragedies, and they both were tragedy, both in Staten Island and in Ferguson, the death of these black individuals. I think what we're seeing is a very, important and helpful dialogue.
Activists have pointed to a number of things. One of the things they're pointing to when they say police are aggressive is this militarization of police forces around the country. Do you lend weight to that?
Well, I think it's certainly true that the police are much better armed, if I could use that term, but so is the threat to them. I have a brother who was a Houston police officer for over 20 years, a SWAT officer, and he would tell me stories about the kind of threats that they were going up against. And quite frankly, I would like our police officers to be properly armed to respond effectively to those threats. And so long as they have the appropriate training in terms of how they use this increased armament, I don't have a problem with the additional armament that the police officers have today to deal with the increased threats in our community.
Is there a gun problem in this country?
Is there a gun problem in this country? Well, I am certainly an advocate of a Second Amendment and the right to bear arms in this country. It's one of our fundamental rights. But I also understand and agree with the Supreme Court of the United States when they say that appropriate regulation is certainly constitutional. And let's face it, there are people in this country that have possession or access to weapons that, quite frankly, we don't want them to have access to weapons and shouldn't have access to weapons under the rules and regulations passed by Congress, passed by state legislators. But I think that in certain cases we have an issue with guns in this country. But again, I also recognize the fact that it is a fundamental right in this country to be able to bear arms.
That was former Attorney General of the United States, Alberto Gonzales. He's now the Dean of the Law School at Belmont University in Nashville, Tennessee. Sir, thank you very much again for your time.
Thank you.
That was the former U.S. Attorney General, Judge Alberto Gonzalez. I would like to go to Dr. Alexander for your initial thoughts on the interview, sir, and to also ask, where do you think an appropriate place is to begin this conversation?
Well, first of all, let me say this. I agree with a number of the things that the judge just suggested in terms of what the issues are currently in this country and how we need to be and how we need to engage them. So I don't want to be redundant in that sense. But one thing I can say, very basic and fundamental, is the fact that every community across this country, every police department across this country really should step back and make an assessment of itself and make some determination as to how well are we engaged with the community as a police department, and how well is our training, and what are we doing to build those relationships with the community as well too. But also have to be mindful of the fact this is just not about police. This is also about a community that's engaged with this police department, that's partnered with this police department, that supports the police department when they're making every attempt to do things right. And then when they do have problems that may come up that may create some concern or some pause, they're able to sit down and work through these issues together. That's the first basic and fundamental place in which I think community and police are going to have to begin their relationship, if they have not already done so.
I'd like to bring in Lori Friedel on that point. As we do exactly that, and as these police departments around the country sort of take stock of where they are, what can we do to help? How do we get in there and identify the problems?
Well, both the director and Attorney General Gonzalez mentioned training, and I think training is critically important. And one of the things that I think is critical is to train police on not just explicit biases, which is how we've been thinking about this issue, but implicit biases. Because the modern science of bias tells us that bias has changed over time. In our grandparents' time, it was more likely to be explicit bias, like a racist. Now it's more likely to manifest as implicit bias, which means even our overwhelming number of well-intentioned individuals in policing around the country can have biases that impact on their perceptions and their behavior, but training can educate them on these biases and help them reduce and manage them.
I would ask if you would agree with those sentiments, and I know that you have been involved with some of these police organizations. Is this the way forward?
I would say, yes, Cal, that is part of the way forward, that you've got to have, I would say, very intentional training. And it's more than, some people have talked about is it diversity training? It's not diverse. Diversity simply means that you recognize that there are differences that are there. You're talking about cultural competency. You're talking about helping to create an area of awareness and understanding for those that may be different. And so it is a first step in that process, but it's a multifaceted process in order to create trust and support in an environment where people historically have not trusted each other.
And Chris, I'd ask you, that historical aspect is key, right? I mean, that's what's surrounding this entire conversation.
It is, and we have to go back and look at some of the things that are the root causes of the problems in communities, not just in Ferguson. I was in Ferguson for a couple of weeks and talked to a lot of African American males who feel like they're quite under siege by the police department and they want to change. People who have had a driver's license for just a couple of years have been pulled over more than 24 times, and only of those 2 incidents were tickets issued. So the people in that community really feel there is a historical legacy with police harassing them there.
Whitney Dow is in our New York studio, and I'd like to bring him in here because I think it's an appropriate time for him to talk about his project. You can find his project. It's called whitenessproject.org. You can go online there and take a look at some of the videos. But Whitney, I'll turn it over to you. If you could just give us sort of a broad stroke of this project, what you were hoping to achieve.
Well, the project is called the Whiteness Project, as you mentioned. And I created this project to try and bring white people into this discussion as vested partners in it. And what I mean by that is that I've done a lot of films over the years on race. And when people look at race, and I think white people look at race and racial incidents, they always see it as something outside themselves, that they look at something like Ferguson, and well-intentioned white people look at Ferguson and they say, well, that's something that's outside of me that needs to be fixed, the police department, as opposed to recognizing that they are also part of the paradigm, and that they can they can impact what happens with the police department, because the police departments are effective agents of us. And that's what's been so interesting about seeing all these protests across the country, is that it's not just black people protesting and saying, hey, this has to stop. It's also white people recognizing that they have a vested interest in changing the dynamic.
We saw a little bit of that on Saturday, Chris, and I think a number of people have pointed this out, that it's important that white Americans get out there, and maybe we're seeing that for the first time in my generation. How key is that?
That's very key, because that shows that this is more than just a black issue. It's a nationwide issue, and everybody in this country has a vested stake in making sure the legal justice system works properly, that good policing is done in each of our communities, and that outpouring of different ethnicities that are showing up at these marches across the country is a demonstration of that.
Dr. Alexander, your thoughts?
Well, I would agree, and certainly, if we look at Berkeley, California, for example, and you look at the demographics in Berkeley, and certainly you've seen a lot of the outspokenness and even some outrage from a few people in regards to these incidents that has occurred as well, too. So this is, I truly believe what we're going through at this moment in time in American history is going to be written down. And I don't think this is going to go away. I think the American people, all American people, quite frankly, and there's a large segment of this country that wants something different. They want to see something different. And I think through technology, now that we have videos, the stories that used to be told verbally are now actually being validated in the minds of some people, that there may be some things in our criminal justice system that are yet to be corrected. And I think we have to move forward as a nation with this, so that our relationship amongst each other as Americans in this country, that we remain strong. And that is so important, I truly believe, to the integrity and to the public safety of this country at large. So we're at this moment in time in American history. But I am very optimistic enough to believe that in spite of America's long history with this, we have made great successes as well, too. And I think this is one of those times in history in which we're going to continue to make those successes. People are going to continue to march. None of us are going to uphold violence. That is totally unacceptable. From Berkeley to New York and from Miami to Montana, that is not acceptable whatsoever. But individuals being able to exercise their First Amendment right, we all are going to support that in making sure that voices need to be heard. And what changes need to be whatever changes need to be made in this country, we're going to move together as a nation of Americans, and we're going to get it done. And I'm very optimistic about that.
Let me get Dr. Henson to weigh in on this, and I hope Dr. Alexander is right. We're 2 years away from the Newtown shooting, and not a lot has changed in this country when it comes to gun laws, and I think this is a very important point. How do we keep this in the national consciousness and make real progress? How do we not forget about this in the age of instant media where people's attention spans aren't very long?
I think the interesting thing with this is I don't think we're going to go back. When you have really those civil protests in over 100 cities, it's a change. And I think that the good thing about it is there's a climate that says we need to talk about it. I am from Ferguson, Missouri. My family has been there for more than 100 years. But I also done diversity and cultural competency training across this country for more than 15 years. What I know is that it is time for this conversation, that we had the straw that broke the camel's back in the two situations with Michael Brown and Eric Garner. But this country was ready for that conversation, and they needed actually to have something to ignite it. I don't think it'll go back, and I think the good thing about it is about people who talk about justice. It is white, black, it is other. Everybody right now, I think, is at least, if they're not engaged, they're sitting up and saying, should I be engaged? And that's where we need to be.
I know that Lori Friedel wants to jump in. Before I get to Florida, I want to go back to New York, and I would ask I would ask Whitney Dow if you expected the kind of reaction that you've had. The project and the documentary that you made has seen really strong reaction from both sides.
Yeah, I mean, I did, and I'll tell you why I expected the big reaction. As I said, I've been making films around race for a number of years, and I think that, and I've seen that white people are desperate to get into this conversation, and they really don't. They always feel that they're listening, and I think that there's so much fear and about saying something wrong that having it that I think white people are really, really looking forward a way into this, because as we can see, people want to be part of this, and I would say that when you start having these conversations, what I would ask is that because of some of the, you know, as you said, there was a lot of reaction to it, some of it was negative. When people are coming into this conversation and saying things, you have to give them a little bit of a break, because white people aren't used to talking about their own race. They're used to talking about other people's race. And I think that you have to give them some latitude for how they engage this when they start talking about it.
Dr. Friedel, would you agree with everything?
Absolutely. And the key that I've been hearing is the importance of bringing the police and the community members together. And in fact, when we brought them together around this new paradigm based on the modern science of bias, I've seen great changes in the dialogue. Usually they come together and the community thinks the police, there are many evil people in policing and that they need to stop being racist. And the police are very defensive because of that terminology. When I get into a room with community stakeholders and police, and we explore the modern science of bias and the fact that even well-intentioned police can have biases that impact on their behavior, this has provided a common ground, a common understanding of the issue, and also a common understanding and a way to move forward. We leave the room with action plans. What do the police need to do in concert with their community members to promote fair and impartial policing?
Thank you very much. We're going to have to take a short break. When we come back, we're going to hear firsthand from our own reporting team. Plus, we'll hear from you, our audience. This is Talk to America on Voice of America.
What we do is bring viewers the stories behind the stories.
We are able to touch on things that are important to people.
So you name it, we talk about it. The issues that we discuss are pertinent to most people on the African continent.
It's really a conversation the same way that you would bring a friend to your home and ask them what's going on. And our correspondents will do that and answer those questions through their own eyes.
Washington Forum is made by the viewers, for the viewers. I'm bringing something to Africa.
We hope that our viewers are getting inspired when they watch our show, but they're learning, getting a view of the world from a different perspective.
We go beyond the headlines and dig a little deeper so that people can have better information to help them in their lives.
My role as a journalist is to inform the world, to make a difference, to make a change. That's what makes me tick.
Welcome back to Talk to America. I'm Cal Perry. Today, we're discussing racial justice, or the apparent lack of, in American society. It's a hot topic, of course, as you would expect, all over social media. Our own VOA's Andrew Palczewski joins us now for some of that reaction. Andrew.
Thanks very much, Cal. Ever since the Michael Brown and Eric Garner decisions, people have been taking to the streets of major U.S. cities in protest. But many others around the world have taken to social media instead to express anger about those decisions, to ask questions, and to leave their comments. Here are some of those comments now that people have been leaving on Voice of America's English News Facebook page. From Facebook, user D writes, "Although I am not an American, I am touched by what's happening in your states. Please, police and judiciary, hear what your brothers and sisters are saying." Vahid from New Zealand, in support of the protesters, says, "When injustice becomes law, resistance becomes duty." Ida from the Philippines said that permitted and peaceful assembly that the government tolerates, but the authorities shall still respect the right to free assembly and to protect lives of the people in protest. But not all of the comments were in support of these protests. Pashko from Albania wrote, "Respect the police. Police have to do the job." So as you can see, there are a wide range of opinions on these issues from the social media sphere, and surely more to follow in the days and weeks to come. Back to you, Cal.
Outstanding. Thank you very much, Andrew. I want to reintroduce our panel of experts. Dr. Cedric Alexander is the Director of Public Safety in DeKalb County, Georgia, also the President of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement. Whitney Dow remains in our New York studio. He's the director, producer of the Whiteness Project. You can find his work at whitenessproject.org. And Lori Friedel, racial profiling expert, associate professor at the University of South Florida, is on Skype from Tampa. Here in our Washington studio, we have Dr. Mady Henson. She's the president of Covenant House, and VOA's Chris Simpkins. I'll start here in studio. I don't want this to become, and I have a number of producers very worried that it will become a discussion about guns, but I don't want to not discuss guns today. You heard my question there to the former Attorney General. Are we able to put ourselves in the police shoes enough? Is there a gun problem in America, Chris?
I think there is. There are a lot of guns, and they are, in a lot of cases, turned on police. And police know this, so they have to react in a certain way. But we do have too many guns in this area, and we know that it has presented a big problem for us.
Dr. Mady, does it get in the way of a discussion, a fruitful discussion about race in this country? Does guns get in the way of that discussion?
Well, I think there are two different discussions, as you said, and sometimes they get tangled and then people can't hear the other discussion. So whether we're talking about Second Amendment rights or we're talking about the right of someone who uses a gun and does something on either side of that law that's inappropriate, I think those are two different discussions, and I don't think we should mix those. What I do know is that, yes, if we want to talk about, are there weapons that are out there that should not be in the hands of some? The answer is yes. Are there weapons in the hands of some that should have them and are misusing them? The answer is yes. So I think that's a different conversation. And how do we move to the next stage? How do we get to a point where the first thing that I think about is not pulling my weapon, but the first thing that I think about is how do I actually de-escalate this situation, have a conversation, understand what's going on so that we don't find ourselves in the situation we're in today.
And Lori Friedel in South Florida, I know you sort of walked us through some of the basics of this. How do we get there? You heard from Dr. Henson. Do we get in a room with the police, and how does that go? I mean, how does that actually play itself out?
Right. Well, first of all, the police need to be trained in how biases manifest in even well-intentioned law enforcement. And the U.S. Department of Justice has invested funds into the fair and impartial policing training perspective. With 5 training programs, we go around the country, we teach command staff, mid-level managers, supervisors, recruits, in-service patrol, as well as trainers. And again, it's on the science of bias and how stereotypes, even in well-meaning cops, can impact on their perceptions and their behavior. And our mantra is this: policing based on stereotypes can be unsafe, ineffective, and unjust. And it's not just about racial and ethnic stereotypes, it's about gender and socioeconomic status and religion. So I think training is key, but also, again, bringing police and the community members into the same room to get on the same page, understanding both explicit bias, meaning those ill-intentioned people, for instance, racists, but also even how well-intentioned individuals can manifest bias. And there's also implications of this science for use of force training, modern use of force training, that is very important.
Dr. Alexander, I assume you're sort of living this on a daily basis in and around Atlanta. It's a very diverse county, DeKalb County. Is this what you're seeing? Would you put the emphasis on getting police into the community and having this discussion?
Well, one of the advantages we have in my county, specifically in DeKalb, elected officials and appointed officials such as myself, we have great working relationships with our communities. They're not foreign to us, and we're not foreign to them. And it's a practice in which has been in place for a very long time, even before I came here. But part of what we make ourselves do on a continual basis is never underestimate those relationships to the point where you take them for granted. To keep those relationships going requires work. And we attend community meetings, we have community functions, we engage our community in various activities that take place in the police department, and they invite us to a number of activities as well too. So that is very important, and there's a number of police departments across the country that operate that way. But there's still many departments across this great country that as well are challenged, and some are maybe not doing it intentionally, and then there's some trying to figure out how to do it. But I truly believe that the Justice Department and the cops office has done a tremendous job in helping communities across this country begin to engage in a more meaningful way. And we have to make sure that that continues, because at the end of the day, the community needs public safety, and public safety needs the community as well too, if we all want to keep ourselves safe.
Dr. Alexander, let me ask you a follow-up, and let me talk for a minute about the role that the prosecutor plays. Certainly, as we saw Ferguson sort of unfold, and I'm sitting at home, I'm watching the coverage of it, that prosecutor didn't seem like a prosecutor to me, and there's been a lot of discussions about his relationship with the police, and I fully understand prosecutors have to work hand in glove with the police in places around the country. Is that an issue? Is that something we need to look at?
Well, in that particular community, it appears to have been an issue, but I don't believe you can take every community and paint it with the same brush. Two things here. One, what we all know is that there has been a climate or an atmosphere of a lot of mistrust between that Ferguson community or that entire St. Louis community. Quite frankly, many aspects of many areas of that St. Louis community did not have a great deal of confidence in its criminal justice system. And I'm glad to hear us talk about it beyond police, because this is truly an issue beyond police. The entire criminal justice system is being questioned in terms of how we do business. And there's an outcry in this nation from a variety of different people across this nation who are saying maybe we need to take another look at our criminal justice system. Not that it is broken, but maybe there are some things that we can do better. And I think being able to take a look at that prosecutor's office where you had no confidence, people in that community had no confidence, and the outcome of that grand jury was the outcome of that grand jury. It is what it is, but you got to have a community that has a sense of trust in its criminal justice system. So there's a lot of work to be done there, not just with police, but with that whole criminal justice framework there in that community. And even across this nation, it came up earlier as to should we bring in a special prosecutor. I don't know whether we should or not. I think it requires more conversation, and I'm glad the conversation is at least emerging. And I think there need to be a number of discussants around that conversation, both from the community and from the legal community as well, as well too. So some determinations will be made as I believe we move forward with this issue.
I want to bring in Whitney Dow again in our New York studio, because we're balancing two things here. We have the localized incidents, and I want to hear more from Dr. Henson about what you saw play out in Ferguson, but I also want to keep an eye on the big picture, and I know that's what Whitney's been doing with his project. And in the interviews you did, were you surprised by any of the things people had to say? It provided an interesting perspective, certainly.
No, I wasn't surprised, and I think that if people go look at the project, they'll see that the interviews are paired with data. They're paired with data points to show either how white people misperceive how their place in the United States, or how the views that they're expressing are mainstream. I think that, if you look at some of the stuff, people say, well, this person sounds racist, or they're saying something that, they're talking about affirmative action, they're talking about what they owe black people. And then if you look at the data, what they're saying is not particularly out of the mainstream. It's kind of common white thought. But what I wanted to say, I wanted to go back to something that Dr. Alexander said, which I think is interesting, is I think that when it comes to the police, it's kind of the same discussion that I've been having with white people. If you attack them and tell them they're wrong, you're not going to get anywhere. And the same way that I think that you need to bring white people into the conversation and recognize that it's in their interest to change the racial dynamic in the country. The police, I think, will be safer if they change the dynamic of how they interact with communities of color. I think that some of the protests, it disappoints me when I see there's so much sort of anger being directed at the police, because as soon as you attack someone, they're going to stop listening. And I saw an interview with Ray Kelly, and I was sort of disappointed in hearing him talk about it, because every time he was asked about the Garner incident, he wanted to talk about the levels of crime in the black community, as opposed to looking at the Garner incident and saying, well, is this an incident we can look at and learn something from, and perhaps make our officers safer as well as the people they're policing safer?
I see multiple people shaking their heads. I'll toss it to Lori Friedel. Go ahead.
Good. No, I love what Whitney said. We cannot push police up against the wall and expect them to change. And our whole conversation in this country about racial profiling has assumed that only police with explicit biases produce it, ignoring the other. And this has led not only to distortions in terms of how the community sees the police, but the police have tended to minimize the problem. Because if bias in policing is only produced by racists, and they look around them, and they look in their heart, and they see all those racists, they don't see those racists, they're going to reject this issue and say it's overstated. So by going into the room and talking about the science, when we walk into a room to do our training, they are defensive or even hostile. They do not want to be there. They hate this topic. As soon as we start talking to them about how their mind works, how bias manifests in even well-intentioned individuals, they calm down, they enjoy themselves, and they walk out with a new understanding as well as skills.
Dr. Alexander, would you agree with everything that was just said?
Yeah, I mean, I would. I mean, absolutely. But here again, this is just not about police. Police is the one unit that we all come in contact with first. They're the most public, the most visible. That's who we call when we need help or assistance. But this is just not about the police departments across this country. It's about a much broader criminal justice system, which is driving much of the sit-ins and the die-ins and the demonstrations that we see that are going on across this country. So police is one aspect of that. And you're right, you can't approach anyone, whether an individual or a group, and just be totally negative. We all have to be open to change. We all have to be open to listen. But a lot of those attitudes, quite frankly, too, are driven by the attitudes at the top of that organization, by supervisors and by bosses and by leadership in those agencies. And if at the top of that organization, if those below them know that we support this competency training, we support bias training, and I even avail myself to this training so that I can role model and demonstrate what I want the behavior of my men and women to be, goes a long way. And everyone may be a little comfortable at first when it comes to talking about race and our own internal biases that we may have, that we may consciously or not consciously be aware of. But at the end of the day, the most important piece is what have I learned about myself, and what have others learned about themselves as well, too. I mean, look, it is clearly important for all of us that we find a way to work through these differences. They will have challenges to them, but they're not impossible. And for us to continue to be a strong nation, we really don't have a choice but to begin to work on these issues. Are we going to resolve all of them? No, we're not, but we're going to be in a much better place as we move forward with our dialogue, as you've heard all your guests speak to very eloquently. We're going to be a lot further ahead than where we are now, I truly believe, over time.
Let me bring it back into the studio for a minute. Dr. Henson, joined by Chris Simpkins. You both have spent a lot of time on the ground in Ferguson. Chris, let me just start with you. We have to have this conversation. It's a hard conversation to have. When you were out there doing interviews on the street in Ferguson, was it hard getting people to talk about this?
Not at all, because people have for so many years in that community been frustrated, and they were looking for avenues to speak out. So when the media attention and the media spotlight hit Ferguson, I overwhelmingly think a lot of people in that community wanted to talk to the media about it and wanted the media to do reporting that focused on the complex issues that have existed in that country, in that community for so long.
If you could talk for a minute about some of those issues that surround the community of Ferguson, especially for our international viewers, I think there's some intricacies in there that are hard to explain, right?
I think, Ferguson is a suburb of a major metropolitan city. It is like many of the other suburbs around our major metropolitan areas. There are intricacies from the standpoint, as Chris talked about, historically. I don't know of an African American who had not had an experience, or someone that they loved and cared about had not had an experience that may have been negative with the police over the years. And so what does that mean? That gives, when he talks about people were ready to talk, people were ready to talk. The issue runs around, are there going to be some people that are going to do some things that are wrong? Are there going to be some rogue, whether they're officers or others that are out there? The answer is yes. People need to understand and feel, though, that there's a system of justice, that there is a system of equity, that if this does occur, that I can trust that there's a process in place that will allow me to understand how we're getting to at least hear the issues, talk about the issues, and at least feel that we've gone through that process. I think that is why you see so much outcry. It is the issues of those lost lives of young and African American males that we've been seeing and that we all know about. It is also a system of justice that people right now don't understand and don't know where it is that they can go to really get what they believe to be just.
In the piece that I sort of wrote to open the show, I say in the piece there's this feeling now that white people just have a very different experience with police than African Americans in this country. Are we there? Have we arrived to that point where people are kind of willing to say that's a fact?
Well, I think, hopefully we're at a point where people will ask the question, because you're right. There are many people who haven't had that experience. I can even speak in my own situation. I have a young 20-year-old son who has been stopped more than 35 times, and never has there been a ticket in his case. So pulled out of a car, thrown against a car, asked whose car are you driving? All kinds of inappropriate questions. Because of, as was mentioned earlier, there are biases, there's profiling, but in addition to that, it is really this lack of understanding that you're going to see good in all, and particularly young African-American males. There are a lot of good ones that are out there, and everybody isn't actually to be perceived as bringing trouble. So when we look at it from that perspective, I think the conversation is there, and I have had the conversation with people that are close to me across all walks and races, because they do now want to talk about the fact of, is there something that happens different in your family, for your son, for your husband, for your brothers, than happened for mine? Because many have not had those same experiences, and we need to talk about that.
I hope our viewers will check out Chris Simpkins' reporting at voanews.com, and I know a lot of that reporting, you come armed with numbers and statistics.
Yeah, that's right. And the statistics are not very good. And what I heard from over and over in Ferguson was that people want to see more diversity on that police department. The predominantly African-American community, there's less than 60 officers on that force. Only just a few are African-Americans. So not only do the people there want to see diversity and more minorities hired on that force, they also want to see more promotions, and that African-Americans who join the force can succeed.
Thank you very much for that. We're going to have to take another break. Don't go away. The discussion is going to continue here on Talk to America on VOA.
We are able to touch on things that are important to people on an everyday basis. We hope that our viewers are getting inspired when they watch our show. They're getting a view of the world from a different perspective, things that perhaps are not in their immediate vicinity. Today, I could put in on the show something that is a little different, a little unique, and this gives me that inspiration to come to work.
Wherever you are, Voice of America is on air, reaching more than 130 million weekly, worldwide, in more than 40 languages. Online, social media, and breaking news from around the world. On the go, dozens of new features on popular platforms with new apps and trending topics. Voice of America, on air, online, on the go.
Welcome back. I'm Cal Perry. Are some police officers guilty of racial bias? And if so, what are the solutions? These are just some of the many questions we're trying to answer here today on Talk to America. Dr. Alexander, let me go back to you. I'll let you pick up where Chris left off. He was rattling off some of those statistics, and I would ask you to kind of, well, put on that hat of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement when you answer the question.
What was the? Can you reiterate the question again?
Well, we just went through a number of statistics, and I'm trying to look at this both ways. And I'm trying to look at this also from the perspective of police officers who every day go out and are faced with very dangerous situations, very difficult situations, and I want to try to have both those sides.
Well, let me say this: it is a very dangerous job, but at the same time as well, too, the communities across this country deserve to have good, fair law enforcement, and people feel that they're being treated respectfully. It's no question about that. And at the same time, too, it becomes imperative that communities, each and every community, also understand what those challenges are as it relates to police. And the only way that you and I will ever understand what our challenges are, what my expectations are as a tax-paying citizen in a community where I expect good public safety, and as a public safety officer, as someone who needs and wants to be trained to provide the kind of service that you certainly do deserve as a citizen in this country. So when I wear this hat every day as national president of Noble, I always keep in mind of one thing. For us, it's all about respecting the civil rights and the human rights of others. And we monitor those behaviors in police departments and criminal justice system across this country. And I would say to you also this, I've spent some time in Ferguson very, very early on, post the Michael Brown shooting. And I had an opportunity to spend some time with the chief there, Tom Jackson. And even in our discussions about moving forward and what it is that Noble could help him and his department do, he acknowledged the fact that he lacked diversity in that department. He acknowledged a lot of the missteps that he made during the early on in that investigation. And so that event that happened there, and of course the event that happened on Staten Island, continues to be in the hearts and minds of people every day. But in spite of that, we're going to have to acknowledge that something could have maybe have been very different in each one of those cases. And is it training? Is our interactions with the community, learning how to do that better, and the community having responsibility to respond appropriately to police as well too. So this is still going to require a lot of conversation, and there's a lot of emotions around this very, very sensitive issue. But it's always been emotional issues when it comes to race in America. But we got to get to a place that you've heard many of your guests speak to already. We got to get to a place where we can start to have these conversations and they be meaningful to us all.
Let me ask Whitney on that exact point, and you've been doing this now for a great number of years. Is there a guilt that comes when you interview some of these white Americans?
I think guilt is a really complicated thing. And I think that, yes, there is a guilt. And I think that there's a sort of a cognitive dissonance within all white people, both as we see ourselves as Americans as good and just people, and the complications that we feel when we look back across our history and whether we benefited from some of the institutionalized injustices that were part of American history. But what my sort of message, or one of the things that I've learned in doing this, is that, the idea of white privilege always feels pejorative. And I feel that when white people come to this conversation of race, and they come to this conversation about whiteness, they always feel like they have to give up something. Like, I'm recognizing my white privilege, I'm recognizing that somehow I'm guilty about something. And for me, recognizing and understanding that my race, my whiteness, is as active and dynamic a component of my day-to-day life and impacts every interaction I have over the course of the day, has been incredibly freeing of guilt, because you can't be guilty for how you were born. You can't be guilty for the past. You can be guilty of how you live your life. So I think by embracing the conversation and trying to understand how your whiteness affects your own personal paradigm kind of relieves you of guilt.
Lori, let me ask you to jump in on that point, because you work with police officers, and how does this all play into it?
It plays into it quite a bit. And indeed, like I said, they come in very defensive, and they think that they don't have biases that impact on their policing, and they can come to understand that they do. And, you know, I want to also go back, because you talked about the importance of diversity in agencies. And in fact, there's a lot more that agency leaders need to be doing. We need to be thinking about what's the message they're sending to their personnel. What's the policy that they have that defines bias in policing? Promotions, training, outreach, accountability such as body cameras, maybe even measurement in the form of stop and frisk or vehicle stop. There's a lot of things that chiefs need to be doing in order to promote fair and impartial policing in their agency.
Our social media team has, throughout the show, been tweeting and posting, and was doing so before the show as well, taking some of their comments. Andrew Palczewski is standing over right there at our social media spot for the reaction. Andrew.
Thanks, Cal. Well, just as we've been talking about these issues here in the studio, people around the country and around the world have been raising their voices about Michael Brown, Eric Garner, and race relations in America. We have a few more comments from our viewers from our VOA social media channels. Jeffrey is from the U.S., and he writes on Facebook that protesters are guaranteed the right to peaceful assembly, but it's only peaceful, not trashing the neighborhood. Echoing a lot of responses we've received, commenter Gio calls the state of race relations in the U.S. a serious morality disaster. And Jackie offers this stark impression: the color of your skin is a death sentence. So again, strong opinions from across the spectrum, Cal, and across the world. Back to you.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Let's keep it in studio just for a minute. Dr. Henson remains here, as well as Chris Simpkins. And I know, Chris, let me start with you, because I know I'm going to go home today, and I'm going to spend most of the day thinking about stuff that we didn't talk about that I wanted to. What haven't we talked about today?
Well, I think we haven't talked about, again, how do we get to a place where we attract the attention of lawmakers to sit down and put together some meaningful pieces of legislation. And I think coming up in this new Congress, there'll be an opportunity to that, because I don't think that lawmakers can look the other way while there are demonstrations being held around the country and say we can't enact at least one piece of meaningful legislation that'll move the process forward.
Is that where we're headed, Dr. Henson? Are we headed for the Capitol?
Well, I think we are. We're here in the nation's capital, so clearly that's at the forefront of our minds. I think it is important. It is greater than just training at the local level. It is about policy. It is about procedures that are in place. It is about legislation. If we look at race relations any place across this country, whether we're talking about when the Civil Rights Acts were actually enacted and signed into law in '64, we're talking about busing in schools and that ending, there was legislation that actually pushed this to the next level so that we actually could move over and start to look at this and work differently. And so I think legislation is a part of what happens in America that allows us to actually go and do the things that it is that we really want to do.
Is part of this that it's new for my generation? Does that play a part in this, do you think?
You know, it's interesting for me. I think that there is it new? I think that there has not been a whole lot of education around it. It's unfortunate, but what I find also that even when we talk historically about the civil rights in this country, for many young people coming up, they still have not gotten that education. It's still not in the history books. For many, and so it is a surprise for many of them. I think that's why you also see why so many young people have joined those that are out protesting, because the sheer nature of what's happening for them doesn't make any sense. And so, no, it's new because they haven't been exposed to it. The reality of it is it's a good, healthy new, because now we have those that are saying, why shouldn't it be? The social media aspect of it has changed the way that we interact and we get information about anything. And so, therefore, they're educating themselves. Their friends are educating them. Young people are doing it across not only the country and the world. And so this looks very different. And that, for me, I think is the hope.
Chris, you'd agree?
I do. I really do.
I want to get back down to Florida and Lori Friedel, the associate producer, because I know you've done a lot of work on these body cameras, police cameras, and there's been a lot of discussion about this, and we hear social media. That's obviously a huge part of this. Do you think we're headed in that direction? And there are those, of course, who would say, well, it doesn't really matter. Take a look at what happened in New York City.
No, I think it does matter. We are definitely in an era with the increased adoption of body-worn cameras on the part of police departments. It was already increasing before Ferguson in New York, and now it's even on a higher trajectory. And this is good news, because what cameras are supposed to do is improve the behavior of both the police officer and the community member. And there are some preliminary studies that show that is the case. And then also, very importantly, provide accountability for both the community member and the police officer. For the police officer, his or her activities are on tape. For the community members, it is the case that they sometimes come in and lodge complaints where when you turn a camera on the scene, you see that it wasn't the case. So I have a lot of hope overall, and I think body cameras are a good mechanism for helping us to get there.
Dr. Alexander, do you agree?
I concur wholeheartedly in regards to what your guest just stated here again without being redundant. I truly believe that's the technology of the future. For a variety of reasons which were just outlined. And I think as we move forward, it's going to build a sense of confidence in all of us to check ourselves and make sure that we're doing the things that we're supposed to be doing, both as professional law enforcement officers and also those as law-abiding citizens as well, too.
Whitney, let me toss it to you. Social media has changed everything. Has it changed the way that white Americans are viewing this?
Absolutely. I think that you're getting access to stories. I think that and access to ways of thinking about yourself. I thought the criming while white hashtag that was trending a few days ago was really, really interesting because it got white people to think about not something bad that's happening to somebody else, not some racial injustice, but the inverse of it of what benefit have I had from being white. And I can speak for myself. Look, your guest talked earlier about her son being pulled over numerous times. When I was in college, I was pulled over on a motorcycle, no license, no registration, no insurance. The police sort of laughed about it and let me go. I mean, I recognize that I get benefits and I'm treated differently by the police because I'm white. I've never been stopped and frisked. And I'm sitting here in my jacket, but I wasn't like the greatest kid. You can ask my parents. So I think that that's one thing that's been really interesting about social media is be able to get people to look back at themselves and find different ways of processing this.
Lori, I see you smiling, shaking your head.
Yes, I just absolutely agree. And again, it's not about cops saying, I'm going to pull that person over because he's black or I'm going to treat him differently because he's black. It's because we have these linkages in our heads between various demographics and who commits crime. And not only can that make us over-vigilant in some situations, it can also make us under-vigilant. The stories that we share in our training about, how one of my co-trainers was under-vigilant with an elderly person or did not frisk the white woman when indicators were there. So it's absolutely the case. And I'm actually very hopeful because I think we're starting to have a more informed discussion. Police and race issues have come a long way. But fortunately, our expectations are even higher now, and I'm just wanting us to reach them.
Dr. Alexander, I want to give you a last word here. I'm really short on time, though. Please, sir.
Well, let me say this, is that, I think all of your guests and panelists here today have really articulated to us and to this country and around this world as well, too, the hopefulness of what is forthcoming. I myself am committed to help bring about some social change in this country that's going to benefit us at large, and I hear my colleagues there willing to do the same thing as well, too. So thank you for having me today.
Well, thank you, sir. I actually think that is the perfect place to leave it, and that works out well because that's all the time that we have today. I want to thank all of our guests, Dr. Alexander, Whitney Dow, Lori Friedel, Dr. Henson, and, of course, our own Chris Simpkins. Andrew, thank you very much for your assistance on social media. We always want to know what you, the viewers, are thinking, so please do visit us on Facebook. The address is VOA Talk to America, or you can tweet us, #VOATTA. You can tweet me directly @PerryCal.